What is the sexiest scary movie of all time? Is there more than one? And how in the hell am I going to determine this? Stay tuned to find out. Hello and welcome back to my channel. As always, I am Matt from Cleveland Sex Therapy. I'm a licensed clinical therapist, certified sex therapist, and huge horror nerd. As we continue towards arguably my favorite holiday, Halloween, I thought I would do another video on a topic that I am so interested in: the connection between sex and scary movies. Check out my other video here, but for today's video, I thought I would see if I could determine what the sexiest scary movie is of all time. So let's go. All right, this is just my opinion. Why should you listen to me? Well, for horror movie fans, like I said, I'm a really big fan of horror movies and the genre in general. My favorite horror movie is Scream, if you can't tell by the posters in the background. My favorite deep cut horror movie is Triangle. And my least favorite subgenre, which you will see later in this video, is possession and demonic movies. Oof. And I blame that solely on my Catholic upbringing. And as a certified sex therapist, I have the education and experience of working with various different forms of arousal. You will definitely see my bias come out because, as I said, this is such a subjective video that I'm making, but I'm going to do my best to explain my reasoning behind each of my decisions. All right, here we go. So just a real quick refresher for those who watched the video in the past and may have forgotten it or who have never seen it. But there is such an intimate connection between arousal, fear, and intimacy. Without going too much into detail, again, check out the other video if you want more information. But there is a pretty simple equation when looking at this connection. And the equation is simple. Vulnerability plus horror movie equals increased arousal, or the potential for increased arousal. Humans tend to tap into their arousal most when they are vulnerable. Innately, horror movies tend to make us feel pretty uncomfortable. Our cortisol is rising, the adrenaline is pumping, our blood pressure and heart rate are going through the roof. We are feeling exposed. Now let's look at what happens with sexual arousal. Increased heart rate, rapid breathing, your blood pressure is spiking, a release of adrenaline, production of serotonin and dopamine. Sound familiar? Basically, being scared releases the same kind of chemicals and produces the same kind of physiological response as when you are sexually aroused. So with that being said, why not take my two passions and see if I can figure out which horror movie is the sexiest? As with most movie genres, there are subgenres that exist. As someone who has seen many movies in each of these subgenres, I thought it would be a really cool idea to just rank the subgenres from what I think is the least sexiest subgenre to the sexiest subgenre. Obviously, I'll talk about my reasons why and provide you some examples of movies in those subgenres. So let's look at these subgenres. We have slasher, gore, zombie, paranormal, demonic, vampire, psychological, alien, witchcraft, and comedic. So I'm curious, what subgenre do you think is going to be on top when it's all said and done? So if I'm saying vulnerability leads to arousal, then that's just going to be too hard when it's all said and done to figure out, because vulnerability is different for each and every one of us. So I thought I would look at some sexuality staples that show up in a lot of horror films and provide you my reasoning as to why they may have an impact on a person's arousal. Not all nudity is arousing for people, but when you put it in an intimate context, it can be. Watching someone change, for instance, may not be arousing for some people, but for others, it may be the cue that they need to tap into it. Watching people have sex tends to be one of the biggest turn-ons for people. Even talking about sex tends to be a turn-on. So if sex is in a movie, 8 times out of 10, you can expect it to be arousing. Anytime we can relate to somebody and have empathy, it can feel very vulnerable for us. Whether a character just died and we are devastated, or they have a similar personality to us, if we can find ourselves relating to these characters, then when the movie is finished, we can potentially use that to tap into our arousal. Gore is gore. It can be extremely arousing for some and a complete and total turnoff for others. It is a legit wild card. Anticipation is what gets our blood pressure up, our heart rate going, and our mind racing. This is a core feature for both fear and arousal. Even if we don't feel empathy towards the person who is dying on screen, death tends to not be super arousing for people. This is most likely due to the fact that a lot of us have experienced loss in our lives, and that just doesn't tend to feel very sexy. When it's all said and done, this is an opinion video, and you are going to see my bias show up. This is supposed to be fun, right? And so all of this criteria that I just ran through may make sense for some of you and may fly out the window for others. So without further ado, let's dive on in and find out which subgenre is the sexiest. And just for the hell of it, I will give you my favorite movie from that subgenre. All right, starting things off, demonic horror has the honor of being the least sexiest subgenre in all of horror. Why? Well, on the surface, this shit just ain't sexy. Demonic possessions tend to incorporate a lot of body distortions and fluids. And I'm talking like blood and vomit. Here's looking at you, The Exorcist, and The Evil Dead, and The Conjuring. I will say this is my least favorite subgenre, so I was always going to put it in last place. But looking at my criteria, most of these movies don't really have a lot of intimate sexual scenes in them. Although empathy can feel really high for these characters, the amount of gore and death that tends to show up just doesn't really do it for me. My recommendation, a horror movie that I actually find to be completely terrifying, is The Conjuring. I swear to God, I think I had nightmares for months after I saw that. So if you need something to watch, I guess I'm telling you to watch it, even though I have never seen it again since I saw it in theaters. So this follows demonic horror pretty closely because paranormal horror also tends to follow beings who aren't human. So there is this sort of connection when it comes to demonic horror, in my opinion. Spirits and ghosts really like spook viewers and create fear without a physical presence on screen. Even looking at the movies I listed, most of these movies are so good that while I may be extremely vulnerable or feeling vulnerable throughout them, me personally may be too impacted by them after I see them that I'll need to go watch like American Dad or something that will just make me feel better internally. Looking at my criteria though, while empathy is high, I tend to leave these movies just feeling completely drained and exhausted. My recommendation, while a classic of this genre would be Paranormal Activity, a new movie I watched earlier this year that I am obsessed with and gave 5 stars to is Smile. Most alien movies don't take place on Earth. They take place on another planet or in outer space somewhere. I think why I put Alien above demonic and paranormal is because a lot of these movies can make you feel claustrophobic at times, especially if we are sort of in a spaceship in outer space. And that feeling of claustrophobia can then make us want to search out connection. I think a lot of people who go into alien movies are just expecting a fun ride, and although they may be scary, they're not absolutely terrifying. Going off my criteria, this is where we can sort of combine empathy and anticipation when looking at things that can increase arousal for us. My recommendation, I guess my personal favorite alien subgenre movie, comes from the Alien franchise, and that is Alien Resurrection. And now listen, don't give me shit. Is this a great movie? No. But does it have kick-ass scenes and Winona Ryder? Yeah. Zombie movies are fun, plain and simple. And zombie movies come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. You can have comedic ones like Zombieland, classic horror ones like Night of the Living Dead, really cool remakes like Dawn of the Dead, and absolutely terrifying movies like 28 Days Later. I find that the anticipation and nonstop action tend to be pretty high in zombie movies, not including the ones from decades ago. Because of this, I think it really fits well in the criteria listed above. My recommendation would be Train to Busan, the original. I know they're coming out with a remake. It's not out yet at the time of this video, but that movie was so good in my opinion. I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. Comedy is placed here at 6 because laughter, like fear, has a connection to arousal. If fear is on one end, impacting arousal through that anticipation and increased heart rate, laughter is on the other end, increasing arousal through relaxation and comfort. A perfect combination for some of you. My recommendation would be The Final Girls. This may be a little bit more slasher than comedy, but it is definitely funny, and Malin Ackerman is such a good actress in this. I really like this movie. Heading into the top 5, we start with gore. Now, this is where sex and nudity comes into play. A lot of gore movies have this element of combining sensationalized sexuality and horror. These movies tend to be very intense, running at a 100 almost the entirety of the movie. And although a drill through the knee or arms being torn off may not invoke arousal in most of us, the empathy, nudity, and sex can really have an impact us after we see the movie. A recommendation for this subgenre would be the Terrifier franchise, but more importantly, Terrifier 2. I don't know if I'll ever see that movie again. For me, what makes psychological horror truly sexy just depends on what psychological horror you are watching. Although probably the most broad subgenre out of all of these subgenres, there is something intellectual about these movies that gets us thinking. I could have easily put this towards the bottom of this ranking list, but I didn't because I think with these movies, they tend to incorporate a sort of conversation or debate after you watch them. And that right there really opens this up for engagement and connection. My recommendation here, there are so many, but I think I'll just choose one that I listed earlier, which would be Mother. Jennifer Lawrence and Michelle Pfeiffer. What else do you need? All right, now these final 3 subgenres were so hard to rank. Witches, vampires, and slasher films, in my opinion, have all the elements needed to create this really intense connection between arousal and fear. But I had to rank them, so let's see who I put on top. At number 3, we have witchcraft. Witches and women have a really complicated history in our society, especially in the United States. Although witches can be depicted as being old spinster ladies who have warts, there is also this other version of them who tend to be sexy seductresses who use their body and sexuality to prey on their victims. There is a really intense vulnerability, an insecurity, if you will, and also a sensuality that we can even feel when watching these movies. Do we want to avoid these witches or have sex with them? It's really hard to tell. My recommendation is going to be a family-friendly one. I would say my favorite witch movie, outside of Hocus Pocus, would be The Witches, the original with Angelica Houston. The power she exudes is so enticing in this film. When she's dressed up and using the skin of Angelica Houston, and when she's in her truest form. And at number 2, just missing the top spot, would be vampires. Similar to witches, vampires have the ability of using their sexuality to manipulate you in a way of getting what they want, which is your soul. Although some of these movies are very scary and gory, here's looking at you, 30 Days of Night, most tend to be very sultry and sexy. A newer film that perfectly sums this up would be The Invitation. Is it good? Not really. But these vampires tend to be the vampires that are depicted today, which are sexy, beautiful, fit individuals who use their power and sexuality to really get what they want. And my recommendation here would be 30 Days of Night. Is it sexy? No. Is it one of the scariest movies I think I've ever seen? Yeah, it is. And now we have our winner. If you know me, you know that the slasher subgenre is my favorite within horror. So am I biased at making it number 1? Maybe, but hear me out. While the vampire and witch subgenre use sex and sexuality right up front, the slasher subgenre uses it as a way to kill you. We have all heard the rule that if you have sex in a slasher movie, then the chances of you dying are like 90%. This comes directly from purity culture, and all of us can relate to that, especially millennials and those in older generations. There tends to be a lot of sex and nudity in these films, which then can lead us to wanting to have sex. And also in this subgenre, we tend to relate to these characters maybe more so than any other subgenre. These movies focus on teens or regular people who are just trying to navigate their lives like we are as the viewer. So for these reasons, I gotta say the sexiest subgenre out of all of horror is slasher. Oh, and my recommendation would, I guess, be my favorite movie of all time, which is Scream. All right, that's all I got. Do you agree with my ranking? How would you rank these subgenres? Comment down below because I would love to hear it. And please like and subscribe. Until next time.